The jungle didn't wait for men, it watched them. When the soldiers marched in that night, the air was thick, alive, almost breathing with them. Every vine seemed to shift when they weren't looking. Every shadow moved just out of sight. Their compasses spun uselessly. Their radios hissed with whispers instead of static. Then came the first scream, swallowed before it could echo. Boots were left behind, rifles half sunk in mud, and by morning, the jungle was silent again. But under that silence, something ancient stirred, something that had learned to hunt back. The air was thick that night, heavy enough to feel alive. The soldiers trudged through the jungle, their boots sinking into the wet soil that seemed to shift beneath them. Every breath they took came back damp, as though the forest itself exhaled into their lungs. Leaves dripped lazily, though it hadn't rained in hours, and the sound of insects filled every pause in their movement. But there was something different about this silence, a strange rhythm beneath the natural noise, a pulse that beat in time with their steps. As they pushed deeper, the canopy seemed to close tighter above, sealing away the stars and moonlight. The air grew warmer, thicker, almost suffocating, and a low hum echoed faintly through the trees. It wasn't wind, it wasn't animals, it was something slower, deeper, a vibration that carried through the trunks and into their bones. One soldier stopped, pressing his hand against a tree, and swore he felt it move, a slow expansion like lungs drawing air. His words were met with uneasy laughter, but no one met his eyes. Their compasses spun uselessly, each needle pointing in a different direction. The radio crackled with static, then silence. The jungle didn't want them talking to anyone beyond its reach. The captain ordered them to keep formation, but the path ahead seemed to twist each time they blinked. Trails they just walked vanished, swallowed by the growth. Even their footprints filled in behind them, the soil knitting itself shut like skin healing over a wound. The youngest of them muttered prayers, clutching his rifle like a charm. He said the forest was whispering. The others told him to shut up, but when they stopped to listen, the sound was unmistakable, a faint sigh moving through the leaves, almost like speech. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too alive. Each wordless breath felt closer, brushing against their necks, stirring the hair on their arms. The jungle was breathing, and now it was breathing with them. They rested only when exhaustion forced them to. The heat wrapped around their bodies like a second skin, and the smell of damp rot clung to every breath. When they finally collapsed beside a fallen log, one soldier leaned back and froze. The bark pulsed beneath his hand. Not insects, not movement, pulsed. He yanked his hand away, and the spot where he touched it seemed to inhale, drawing the moisture from his glove. The others scoffed until the log exhaled a thin mist of steam that smelled like blood. Sleep was impossible. The jungle hummed through the night, a deep resonance that vibrated their helmets and made their teeth ache. Every so often, a tree creaked like a chest expanding. Leaves rustled. Though no wind stirred them, one man claimed he saw vines shifting toward him, inch by inch, curling like fingers when he wasn't looking. They called him paranoid until his scream tore through the dark, followed by the sound of roots tearing from the soil. By morning, they found only his boots. The rest of him had vanished. The ground where he slept turned soft and sunken, wet with something darker than mud. The captain ordered everyone to move, but the path forward had changed again. The trees now stood closer, thicker, forming walls that pressed them into single file. The air vibrated faintly with each breath, a rhythm too steady to be natural. It was as though the forest was watching, waiting, deciding when to exhale. A corporal tried to mark the trees with his knife, cutting deep notches into the bark as they moved. But after a few minutes, the marks disappeared, sealed over with fresh sap. He cut deeper, furious, and the tree bled. A thick, dark fluid oozed from the wound, steaming in the humid air. The smell was sweet, sickly, and familiar, like iron and rot. Before they could move on, the liquid bubbled, as though boiling from within, and the cut sealed shut before their eyes. The deeper they went, the louder the breathing became. It was no longer faint or hidden, it surrounded them. The forest inhaled, branches rising slightly, and then exhaled with a groan that rippled through the soil. The ground seemed to sink with every breath, swallowing their boots an inch at a time. The captain shouted for calm, but his voice sounded small beneath the endless rhythm. The jungle didn't need to shout to be heard. The first to panic ran. He crashed through the brush, shouting that the trees were closing in. The others followed his voice for only a few seconds before it stopped abruptly, cut off mid-scream. When they reached the clearing where he'd been, all that remained was his rifle, jammed upright in the soil. The ground around it pulsed faintly, as if still digesting. The captain stared, jaw tight, and whispered that the forest wasn't hunting them. It was feeding. By noon, the sunlight above had dimmed to a green haze. The canopy thickened until it blotted out the sky entirely, leaving them trapped in perpetual twilight. The air throbbed with the rhythm of unseen lungs, and the smell of decay grew stronger. One soldier suggested turning back, but when they retraced their path, it no longer existed. The trail was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees that leaned closer with every breath the jungle took. A strange sound began echoing through the forest, not a growl, not a roar, but a deep, wet exhale like air passing through waterlogged lungs. It came from all directions at once, rising and falling like a tide. The men moved faster, hearts pounding, eyes darting to every rustle, but the sound followed, closer with each step until it was impossible to tell where it ended and their own breathing began. Then, for a moment, the jungle held its breath. Everything went still, no hum, no wind, no sound. Even the insects were silent. The soldiers froze, terrified to move. The silence stretched, heavier by the second, until one man whispered that it was over, and then the jungle exhaled. The force knocked them off their feet, a gust of hot, wet air that carried the stench of blood and something rotting beneath the roots. The forest had waited to see how long they would hold their breath. By nightfall, only a handful remained. Their torches flickered weakly, light struggling against the dense mist that clung to the ground. They huddled close, whispering prayers, avoiding the trees that loomed over them like ribs in a massive chest. Each flicker of light revealed shapes that weren't there before, branches that bent like arms, roots that slithered across the soil. One soldier muttered that the forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. The final entry in the captain's journal was written in trembling ink. "It's breathing with us now. No one ever found the patrol again." But years later, when search teams entered that same patch of jungle, their radios picked up something faint, static interspersed with rhythmic bursts of air, as though the forest itself were speaking through every breath. The sound still rises at dusk, carried on the wind, like lungs remembering the rhythm of the men they once consumed. The last radio transmission from the patrol was calm, almost routine. They had entered the southern perimeter at dawn, voices steady as they reported clear skies and normal conditions. Then the signal crackled, faint static rising between words, and one soldier's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The operator tried to raise them again, once, twice, 5 times, but only silence came back. It wasn't interference. It was absence, heavy and final. The patrol had vanished before anyone realized they were even gone. When the rescue team arrived 2 days later, the jungle seemed strangely untouched. No signs of struggle, no broken branches, no tracks to follow, just a trail that stopped as if erased mid-step. The canopy above was so thick it turned day into dusk, and every sound bounced off the trees, repeating in strange echoes that made directions meaningless. The team leader ordered everyone to stay close, but before long, even their footprints disappeared behind them, swallowed by soft soil that shifted like water. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the silence became. The jungle was alive, yes, but not in the way it should have been. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the air felt subdued, pressing down like a weight. The men whispered that the forest had gone still for a reason, as though it were waiting. When they reached the coordinates where the patrol was last heard, there was nothing, no camp, no gear, no bodies. Only the faint smell of iron drifting through the damp air. A private stumbled on something half buried in the mud. At first, they thought it was a branch, but as they brushed away the dirt, the shape became clear, a rifle barrel, twisted like soft metal. The weapon's serial number matched one from the missing unit. The metal wasn't rusted or burned. It had been bent, as if by immense pressure. Around it, the soil was warm to the touch, as though the ground itself had only just cooled after feeding. That night, the search party camped in the clearing. They built a small fire, but the flames burned low, their light barely pushing back the dark. The team leader wrote in his log that the jungle feels awake, that every crackle of the fire seemed to draw unseen eyes from the shadows. One soldier said he could hear breathing behind him, slow and heavy, but when they turned there was only the endless black between the trees. They took turns on watch, though no one truly slept. Near midnight, the static returned on the radio. It started as faint hissing, then grew into a steady pulse, like someone breathing through the speaker. The operator froze, staring at the signal light flickering erratically. Then through the distortion came a single voice. It was faint, broken, but unmistakable. "We're still here," it said. The men crowded around, shouting for a response, but the voice repeated the same words, slower each time, until the signal faded into silence. Morning brought no answers. The fire had died to ash, and the footprints around it looked strange. Half the impressions seemed to belong to the rescue team, but the others were too large, too deep, as if made by something that walked on all fours. One of the men pointed out a new set of marks leading away from camp, dragging lines through the mud like someone had been pulled. They followed them for only a few meters before the trail stopped again, ending abruptly at the base of a massive tree. The bark was torn in deep gouges, the sap bleeding thick and dark. A pendant hung from one of the slashes. Tangled in resin, a small military tag, coated in sticky amber. The name belonged to a member of the missing patrol. The team leader retrieved it, hands shaking, and ordered the others to pack up. But when they turned to leave, the path they had used was gone. The forest had rearranged itself overnight, shifting the trees into new patterns that no map could recognize. They marched for hours, circling the same clearing again and again. The compass spun, the radio hissed, and exhaustion began to dull their reason. At some point, one soldier swore he saw figures moving between the trunks. Men in uniform, faces blank, walking in perfect formation. The others laughed it off until they all saw it. Silhouettes of soldiers marching silently through the trees, their boots making no sound, their heads turned slightly toward the rescue team as they passed. When they called out, the figures stopped. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then the shapes dissolved into mist, melting back into the jungle as if they'd never existed. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the sound of a distant rustling. The men raised their rifles, scanning the perimeter. Something was moving, slow and deliberate, circling them just out of sight. But there was no shape to it, only motion, the shifting of leaves that suggested size far beyond anything human. As dusk fell, the ground began to tremble under their boots. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration, then stronger, until the earth seemed to pulse with life. The trees groaned, bending as if under some great invisible weight. The captain shouted for everyone to move. But before they could, the jungle exhaled, a gust of hot, foul air that blew out their torches and filled their mouths with the taste of copper. In the darkness, something massive brushed past them, unseen but near enough to feel its presence in their bones. When the tremors stopped, 3 men were missing. The others searched frantically, calling their names, but their voices only bounced back in distorted echoes. The missing soldiers' gear lay scattered, torn, and half-buried, as though the ground itself had tried to swallow it. No tracks led away, no sign of struggle. The forest had simply absorbed them, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint smell of rot. By dawn, the survivors were broken. Their eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical. The captain refused to rest. Convinced the patrol was still alive somewhere ahead, he insisted they follow the whispers he swore he heard calling for help. The others followed, too tired to argue, until they came upon a clearing littered with bones, clean, white, and stacked neatly in piles. The tags among them matched those of the missing men. The final log from the rescue team was found months later, water-damaged and nearly unreadable. Most of it was nonsense, scribbles, fragmented sentences, and strange symbols no one could decipher. But one line remained clear, etched in ink that hadn't faded. "We found them, but they're not men anymore." The coordinates listed beneath led nowhere. When new units searched the area, the jungle had reclaimed everything. No remains, no gear, no sign of any living soul. To this day, the last radio transmission plays on loop in the archives, a distorted recording of breathing that rises and falls like the rhythm of a sleeping beast. Some swear that if you listen closely, beneath the static, you can still hear the faint echo of a soldier's voice, whispering, "We're still here." But those who spend too long listening all report the same thing afterward. When they close their eyes, they can still hear the jungle breathing back. The roots did not grow. They crawled. When the soldiers first stumbled into that clearing, the ground seemed oddly uneven, rippling beneath the thin layer of moss. They thought it was mud, a sinkhole perhaps, until one man stepped forward and felt something coil around his ankle. It was a root, thick as a wrist, slick with moisture. He froze, but before anyone could react, it tightened, pulling him down with slow, deliberate strength. By the time they dragged him free, the skin beneath his boot had been torn open, as if the forest itself had bitten him. They decided to camp there anyway. The jungle was endless, and exhaustion had dulled their instincts. As they set up, the air grew heavier, the soil soft enough to sink into with every step. One soldier joked that it felt like the ground was breathing, but no one laughed. The trees stood unnaturally close, their roots sprawling like veins across the earth, weaving between tents, wrapping around supplies. They didn't notice, not yet, how those same roots pulsed faintly under the moonlight. By midnight, the rain began. Heavy drops hammered the canopy, and the men huddled beneath makeshift covers. The wind was still, but the ground moved, slow undulations, like something massive turning just beneath. One of them, a sentry, shone his flashlight toward the trees and caught a glimpse of something wrong. The roots had shifted. They no longer lay flat, but stood slightly raised, coiling like snakes in the dirt. When the light hit them, they froze. A scream cut through the rain. It came from the edge of the clearing, where two men had been digging a drainage ditch. When the others reached them, they found one soldier already half buried, his legs swallowed by a mass of writhing roots. They hacked desperately with machetes, but each cut only made more sprout from the soil. The air reeked of sap and iron, a nauseating sweetness that made their stomachs twist. By the time they freed him, he was limp, his skin pale and bloodless. They buried the body at dawn, though the ground refused to take him easily. The soil pushed back against the shovels, softening only when the captain muttered a prayer. When they finally covered the grave, the dirt shifted one last time, rising slightly, as though something beneath had exhaled. No one spoke during breakfast. Even the birds stayed silent, and the roots, which had been still through the night, now formed a faint ring around the camp, as if marking their boundary. That afternoon, one man swore he saw something move under the surface. The others followed his gaze and watched in horror as the ground bulged, a slow ripple crawling toward them. Rifles were raised, but there was nothing to shoot, only the earth itself rising like a wave. When it reached the edge of camp, it stopped, and the roots began to emerge, inch by inch, slick with black soil. They formed a tangled mass that pulsed faintly, almost like a heart. The captain ordered fire. Bullets tore into the mass, spraying dirt and splinters, but the roots didn't burn. They recoiled, then slithered back beneath the soil, leaving only smoking holes. For a brief moment, the soldiers felt relief. But that night, they woke to the sound of scratching, soft, rhythmic, coming from below their tents. The ground trembled with each scrape, like fingers clawing upward from the depths. No one dared move. They listened as the roots explored beneath them, brushing lightly against their backs through the thin canvas. When morning came, one tent was empty. The man inside was gone, his cot split and torn, the earth beneath it freshly turned. They followed the shallow trail for a few meters until it ended at a tree whose roots were thicker than its trunk. Sap oozed down its bark, dark and sticky, with a faint smell of blood. Someone tried to cut it open, but the wood was wet and fibrous, like muscle. When they split it further, something pale rolled out. A human hand, small and bloated, with the same tattoo as the missing soldier. Panic set in. The men packed quickly, but the forest was no longer the same. Trees they hadn't seen before blocked their path, growing impossibly fast. The roots writhed openly now, crossing trails, dragging through puddles, reaching for their boots. The jungle floor moved like a living thing, its hunger no longer hidden. Every few minutes, another soldier stumbled and screamed, pulled downward as the ground swallowed him whole. The others stopped trying to save them. By the second night, only 4 men remained. They found refuge on a patch of high ground where the roots couldn't reach, yet even there the soil throbbed faintly. The captain sat apart, staring into the dark. He said the forest was feeding, that the roots were veins, drawing from everything they touched. "It's not just killing," he whispered. "It's learning." No one answered. The jungle was too quiet, too aware. Even the air seemed to wait. The next morning, the ground was littered with strange shapes. They looked like cocoons woven from bark and vines, each the size of a man. One of them twitched when touched, releasing a wet hiss. The men backed away, terrified, as the cocoons split open, revealing a body inside, pale, shriveled, but still wearing the uniform of the first man who vanished. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, lips trembling, whispering something that no one could understand before his chest caved inward. They fled in panic, running blindly through the forest, but the roots followed, bursting from the ground in thick, writhing waves. They tangled around ankles and rifles, yanking the soldiers down one by one. Gunfire echoed briefly, then faded, replaced by the sound of dragging, the soft, wet scrape of men being pulled beneath the surface. The jungle shuddered once, then fell silent again, the ground smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Days later, when a reconnaissance team stumbled across the same clearing, it looked untouched. But as they walked through, one of them noticed something strange. The roots near the center were shaped like hands, fingers outstretched, half buried in the dirt. When he brushed one with his boot, it shifted, curling inward ever so slightly, like a reflex. They left quickly, not speaking of what they'd seen. Now, years later, the forest still grows thick over that forgotten place. Locals refuse to go near it, saying the ground hums on hot nights, and if you listen long enough, you can hear faint tapping, like someone knocking from beneath the earth. Scientists call it superstition, but every few years, a traveler disappears without trace, and the trees there always seem to grow taller, stronger, their roots reaching just a little farther. The jungle remembers what it eats, and it's still hungry. The jungle had grown unnervingly quiet after the last man fell. What had once been a chorus of insects, wind, and unseen creatures had turned into a suffocating stillness. The canopy stretched high above, blotting out the moonlight and trapping a humid darkness beneath its cover. When the soldiers whispered, their voices didn't travel, they were swallowed, absorbed by the air. It was as though the forest itself refused to let sound escape, trapping every word, every breath beneath its veil of leaves. They tried to call for rescue, but their radios only spat back echoes. The voices that came through weren't their own. They were fragments, distorted, familiar, but wrong. Sometimes the voices repeated their last words back to them in perfect mimicry, delayed by seconds, like something in the trees was learning to speak. Fear began to spread like fever. The men stopped using names, stopped talking altogether. Their silence felt safer than the replies. At night, the jungle whispered back. It wasn't wind, it was too precise, too deliberate. The sound moved between trees like speech, drifting in soft patterns of rhythm and tone. The men huddled close to their dying fire, straining to make sense of the voices. They swore they heard commands being repeated. Old orders from lost patrols: advance, hold position, report back. Some even claimed to hear their own names, called gently from the darkness just beyond the glow of the flames. By the second night, they realized the forest was copying their sounds. When one of them coughed, the same noise echoed seconds later from deep within the trees. When another dropped a canteen, the metallic clatter was answered by an identical sound, faint but clear, farther away. They began to test it, shouting, firing a single shot, tapping metal against metal. Every noise came back, altered slightly, as though moving through unseen mouths. Something beneath the canopy was listening, and it had learned to respond. The captain ordered them to keep moving. The trail was gone, the compass spun aimlessly, and the air itself seemed thicker the deeper they went. Their boots sank into damp earth that squelched with each step, releasing faint sounds that almost resembled speech. The trees loomed taller, their trunks fused together like ribs around a great lung. Each time the wind stirred, it sounded like the jungle was breathing, slow and steady, exhaling faint whispers that carried no words but endless intent. When they stopped to rest, one soldier pointed upward. Between the dense branches, faint lights flickered, soft, pulsing orbs that swayed like lanterns in the distance. The men thought they were rescue signals, but when they called out, the lights moved. They shifted rhythmically, mimicking the flash pattern of the radio beacons they used in training. It was perfect, down to the second. Yet no human had set them. The jungle had memorized the rhythm of help. That night, the voices returned stronger. The forest didn't just echo now, it spoke first. Words came in, fragmented whispers, forward, lost here. The tones were uneven, but human enough to make them stop breathing. One soldier swore he recognized the voice of his sergeant dead 3 months ago when he stepped forward, rifle raised. The voice changed, imitating his own, whispering, "Come closer." The echo grew louder, overlapping with itself, until it sounded like a dozen versions of him were calling out at once. Panic fractured the group. Men ran in every direction, shouting names that bounced back from the darkness, twisted and warped. Every echo came faster, overlapping, multiplying until it became a chorus of distorted screams. It was impossible to tell which were human anymore. The jungle had learned the pitch of fear and now sang it back to them. The sound was unbearable, waves of noise that seemed to vibrate inside their skulls. By morning, only a few remained. Their voices were hoarse from shouting, their throats raw from breathing the heavy air. The echoes had stopped, but not the watching. They could feel it, the invisible weight pressing from all directions, as though the forest waited for them to make another sound. No one dared speak. Even the crunch of their boots felt dangerous. Every noise an invitation for something to answer. Silence became their only defense. They found a clearing where the echoes didn't reach. The air there was still, too still, like a held breath. The ground was littered with metal fragments, dog tags, rusted helmets, and bones, half swallowed by roots. A soft hum vibrated through the soil beneath their feet, a deep tone that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. One man bent to pick up a tag, but when his fingers touched it, the hum shifted to a whisper. "Stay." He dropped it instantly. The word lingered in the air long after the sound should have faded. That night, they heard singing. It came from beyond the trees, low and distant, a mournful melody without words. It sounded like a funeral march, soft and human enough to stir tears in the exhausted men. But when one soldier began to hum along, the melody changed. It copied his tone, matched his pitch perfectly. The harmony that followed was too exact, too synchronized to be chance. The forest was no longer repeating, it was performing. The air trembled as the song deepened, a vibration that rattled bones and tents alike. The men clutched their ears, but the sound wasn't heard through air. It was inside them, resonating in their skulls. The whispers returned between the notes, now coherent, murmuring their names, their ranks, the final words of their missing comrades. It wasn't memory, it was mimicry with purpose, a language built from everything the jungle had ever swallowed. When the last of the torches went out, the echoes returned to full strength. The forest now spoke without needing voices, the canopy shaking with ghostly words that layered and twisted into impossible phrases. "We are beneath," it whispered, "we remember." The sound didn't travel through the air. It came from the trees themselves, vibrating through bark, traveling down the roots and up through the soil beneath the soldiers' boots. By dawn, the survivors were gone. The camp lay empty, their gear scattered but untouched. The forest was silent again, except for one thing, the faint hum that rippled beneath the canopy. If you stood still enough, it sounded almost like voices, layered and distant, repeating words no one had spoken in years. Those who have ventured near the site since claim the echoes never stopped. They say the forest still speaks, using the voices of the fallen, whispering through the trees to anyone foolish enough to listen. The jungle didn't awaken all at once. It stirred slowly, as if remembering hunger after a long sleep. The soldiers had made camp on what they thought was safe ground, a narrow ridge surrounded by moss and tangled roots. They were wrong. Beneath their feet, life was shifting, ancient and deliberate. The soil pulsed faintly, invisible in the dim green haze, like something beneath the earth was taking its first deep breath in centuries. When dawn came, the air was thick with the scent of sap and rot. The men noticed strange patterns spreading across the trees, dark veins crawling upward from the roots, glowing faintly when the light touched them. One soldier touched the bark and pulled back instantly. It was warm, almost feverish. He swore he felt it move, a subtle contraction, like a pulse. The captain dismissed it as nerves, but the forest had begun to change. The vines were thicker now, hanging like veins from the canopy, dripping with dew that smelled faintly metallic. As they moved deeper into the jungle, every plant seemed to turn toward them. The leaves shifted subtly in their direction, following like eyes. The roots beneath their boots flexed under pressure, giving way and then tightening as if testing their weight. The insects that once hummed endlessly had gone quiet. All that remained was a deep, rhythmic thudding sound, slow, steady, patient. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was listening. By midday, the men's path was blocked. A massive wall of vines had appeared overnight, so thick and woven it looked like flesh stretched across the trees. They hacked at it with machetes, but every cut sealed almost instantly, sticky green fluid oozing to close the wounds. The air grew heavier, filled with the sound of slow creaking, as if the forest was aware of their violence. A single drop of sap landed on one soldier's hand, burning through his glove like acid. He screamed, and the vines shuddered in response. That night, the men posted guards, though sleep never came. The jungle moved in the dark, leaves trembled without wind, and something large brushed past their tents, leaving behind the stench of decay. When the torches flickered, the shadows seemed to crawl, reshaping themselves into long, sinuous figures that vanished as soon as the light stabilized. One guard fired into the blackness, but the echo of his shot didn't fade. It came back deeper, slower, as though the forest itself was repeating the sound. By morning, 2 men were missing. Their rifles lay half buried in soil that still steamed faintly, as though freshly disturbed. Around the clearing, the grass had turned black, curling inward like burnt paper. The captain ordered them to move, but the forest had grown denser overnight. New roots rose like barriers across the trail, forcing them to climb or cut through. Each strike of the machete released a low groan from the ground, and the sound of movement rippled outward, deeper into the jungle. One man collapsed before noon, gasping for air. The medic checked his pulse, but his skin was already covered in green streaks, veins pushing outward, pulsing under the flesh. Within minutes, his body convulsed, expelling thick green fluid from his mouth and eyes. The ground beneath him absorbed it greedily, and a new shoot burst upward from the soil where he fell. It grew fast, twisting around his corpse like ivy, until nothing human remained. The others stared in silent horror. The jungle had claimed one of its own. They began to notice faces, shapes pressed faintly against the bark of trees, mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes that bulged and receded with each breeze. One soldier whispered that the forest was feeding on memory, taking what it consumed and reshaping it. When they passed through a grove, they heard voices calling their names, faint but clear, coming from the direction of the wind. But there was no wind now, only breath. The sun never fully reached them again. The canopy thickened until even the light seemed afraid to enter. When flares were fired, they fizzled out halfway up, smothered by the hanging vines. The jungle had created its own night, a living shroud of leaves that moved with slow intention. The men felt it then, the truth they had been denying. They were not walking through the jungle. They were walking inside it. When one of the remaining soldiers broke and ran, the others chased after him, their boots sinking into soft earth that pulsed with every step. They found his helmet minutes later, crushed and filled with green moss. The ground where he'd fallen bulged slightly, and when they struck it open, roots spilled out, wet, twitching, and still clutching scraps of uniform. Something beneath the surface exhaled a deep, rattling sigh, almost content. Desperation turned to madness. The captain ordered the use of fire, tossing lit torches into the densest clusters of vines. The flames spread quickly at first, then stopped abruptly, snuffed out by the forest's own moisture. The smoke that rose carried no ash, only a thick, sweet smell that made their vision blur. They realized too late it wasn't smoke at all, but spores. Those who breathed it in began coughing violently, their eyes bleeding green tears before they fell silent. The few who remained stumbled blindly, their lungs burning. They reached a clearing where the air felt cooler, cleaner. For a moment, they thought they had escaped, but when they looked down, the soil beneath their feet was no longer earth. It was flesh, soft and pulsing. The jungle had expanded, reaching even here, its roots forming a carpet that breathed beneath their weight. From the tree line, vines began to descend like hands, eager and trembling. The captain dropped his rifle, staring upward. The trees towered like living giants, their trunks glowing faintly from within. The light moved like blood, coursing upward into the canopy. "It's feeding," he muttered. "It's waking up." His voice broke as the ground beneath him shifted, the roots curling upward to cradle his legs like arms. The forest wasn't hungry anymore. It was starving. By the time rescue teams arrived, weeks later, the entire area had changed. The map no longer matched the land. Rivers had shifted, trees stood where there had been none, and the air vibrated faintly, like the heartbeat of something sleeping just beneath the surface. They found no bodies, only strange growths shaped like helmets, rifles, and faces caught mid-scream, fused into bark and vine. The soil was still warm. The hunger had only begun. Locals say the jungle still moves at night, the leaves rustle with no wind, and the ground hums faintly, as though something beneath is still dreaming of the men it devoured. Hunters whisper that the forest doesn't need to chase its prey anymore. It waits. Every few years another patrol goes missing, and the jungle grows just a little thicker. Some call it nature, others call it vengeance. But those who have heard the heartbeat know, it's hunger, and it's awake. The jungle had no edges anymore. What once felt like a forest now seemed endless, looping back on itself with cruel precision. The soldiers moved in circles, following their compass until it spun like a coin. The air had grown too thick to breathe properly. Every inhale felt like drawing mud into their lungs. Sweat clung to their skin like oil, and every shadow looked alive. One man said the trees were closer than before, bending toward them when they blinked. No one argued, they could all feel it too. They had stopped counting the days. Time no longer followed rules inside that place. The sun rose and set in strange intervals, sometimes twice in an hour, sometimes not at all. The men began seeing things in the corner of their eyes, faces half-formed in the mist, hands reaching from the fog only to vanish when touched. They thought it was exhaustion until one of them woke screaming, claiming a vine had been wrapped around his throat while he slept. His neck bore the bruises to prove it. Their rations spoiled faster than they could eat them. The canned meat festered overnight, and their water turned sour with green filaments floating on the surface. When they dug a new hole to draw water, the ground bled instead, a thick, dark liquid rising like sap. They stared in silence before covering it again, too afraid to taste, too afraid to ask what flowed beneath the surface. The forest was feeding itself, and they had disturbed its veins. As the days stretched, their words began to lose meaning. They spoke only in whispers now, afraid the jungle might learn their voices again. The silence was heavier than sound, pressing against their eardrums until some of them began to hum just to stay sane. One night, a low vibration filled the ground like a deep groan resonating through the roots. It wasn't thunder. The sky was clear. It came from below, and it made the ground feel alive. One soldier, delirious from hunger, tried to cut his way out. He hacked through vines until he stumbled into an open space, a patch of bare earth surrounded by massive trunks. The others heard his laughter first, wild and manic. When they found him, he was staring upward at the canopy, muttering that he'd found the sky. But when they looked up, there was no sky, only the shifting mass of branches above, interwoven so tightly it looked like flesh. He started laughing again, louder, until something above dropped onto him, a thick vine that tightened around his chest. His laughter turned into choking. They burned the vine to free him, but it didn't die easily. Even engulfed in flames, it writhed and flailed, slapping at the ground like a wounded animal. When the smoke cleared, they saw that the fire hadn't spread at all. The surrounding foliage remained wet and untouched. Gleaming under the heat, it was as if the jungle allowed the flame to exist only long enough to remind them of its futility. The air was filled with the stench of burned sap and rot. That night, the whispers returned, closer, clearer, familiar. The voices of the missing men drifted through the trees, calling names, giving orders, asking for help. They came from every direction, overlapping until it was impossible to tell which way was real. The captain shouted for silence, but the forest answered in perfect mimicry, repeating his command word for word. Then softly it added new ones. "Stay. Don't leave." The sound came from behind him. No one slept after that. Every rustle made their hearts race. The ground shifted subtly under their tents, rising and falling like breath. A few tried to climb the trees for safety, but the trunks were slick and warm to the touch, the bark coated in something that pulsed beneath the surface. One soldier climbed high enough to vanish into the canopy. Minutes later, his body fell limp and broken, his skin covered in fine green veins. The jungle had absorbed him and spat him back unfinished. By morning, the mist was so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. It wasn't normal fog. It moved like smoke, curling through the trees as though guided by intent. It carried with it a faint metallic scent, and every breath filled their mouths with the taste of rust. Shapes moved within it, sometimes human, sometimes not. A massive silhouette passed by once, brushing the tops of trees without making a sound. The men froze, weapons ready, but no sound followed. Only the faint sound of breathing that wasn't theirs. They found one of their old camps the next day, or what remained of it. The tents were still upright, but they were wrong. The canvas looked like skin stretched over bone, and inside were things pretending to be their belongings. Guns made of bark, helmets that grew moss, rations molded into twisted forms. The forest had replicated their world like a memory gone rotten. The captain ordered everyone to move, but deep down, they all knew it was already too late to leave. That night, one soldier broke the silence. He said he dreamed of open fields, of sunlight and wind. He begged them to wake him if he started sleepwalking. But when dawn came, his cot was empty, and the ground where he slept had opened like a wound. Roots hung loosely above it, dripping with dark fluid. The captain whispered that he was lucky. At least his nightmare ended quickly. The others couldn't tell anymore where dreams stopped and reality began. The sound of flies grew louder as they marched, but they never saw any. The noise was constant now, like static in their ears. Every now and then it changed pitch, higher, sharper, almost forming words. The men plugged their ears, but the sound was inside them, vibrating through their skulls. When it finally stopped, they realized they couldn't hear at all. The silence afterward was unbearable, like the forest had taken even the sound of their thoughts. When their hearing returned hours later, it came with something worse. Whispers echoed directly inside their heads, calm, measured, patient. They didn't come from outside anymore. The jungle didn't need to speak aloud. It was inside them now, moving through their veins, humming beneath their skin. Some began to scratch at themselves, desperate to dig it out, while others stood perfectly still, eyes wide, listening to the rhythm of something ancient whispering through their bones. A storm broke that evening, though no rain fell. The trees swayed violently, but there was no wind. Instead, the forest trembled as though from something massive moving underground. The ground split in places, exposing glowing roots that pulsed like arteries. The light that poured from them was sickly and green, illuminating the men's faces in ghostly shades. They looked at one another and knew they weren't just surrounded by life, they were inside it. The captain ordered them to move toward higher ground, but there was none. The land bent and curved in impossible ways, folding back on itself. The trees shifted positions, creating walls where there had been open paths. No matter which way they turned, the jungle rearranged itself to block the exit. Some men started praying, others simply dropped their weapons, resigned. The captain screamed at the trees until his voice broke. The jungle whispered back, mimicking every word. One by one, the men began to vanish without a sound. No struggle, no cries, just absence. A soldier would turn to look behind him, and the man who had been walking beside him seconds earlier was gone. The forest seemed to close over them, leaves settling gently in their place. When the captain finally realized he was alone, he stopped running. He sat on the ground, staring at his trembling hands. The soil beneath him moved, pulsing gently like breath. He began to laugh. It started as a whisper, then grew louder until it echoed through the trees. "It's awake," he said to no one, "and it's dreaming of us." The ground rose beneath him, roots wrapping around his legs like vines eager to reclaim what they had grown from. His body sank slowly into the soil, his laughter fading as the earth closed above him. The jungle exhaled, satisfied. When the next expedition came months later, they found nothing. No weapons, no bones, not even tracks. But the soil in that region was richer than anywhere else. The trees grew taller, thicker, their leaves an unnatural shade of green. At night, the wind carried faint echoes of voices, laughing softly, whispering commands, sometimes calling for help. Some say it's just the wind. Others say it's the jungle remembering the taste of men trapped inside its living nightmare. The jungle never gave back what it took. The soldiers who entered that cursed expanse became whispers, their names carried only by the wind that sighed through the leaves. It wasn't death that claimed them, it was possession. The forest had a way of keeping what it liked, binding it to the roots, trapping it in the damp pulse of its soil. Every footprint they left filled itself in. Every trace of their passing vanished. The jungle held its prey in silence, refusing to release even their memory. When rescue teams came, they found the forest thicker, older, as if decades had passed overnight. Trees grew where open trails once were, vines hung low enough to brush faces, and the air shimmered with a strange, heavy heat. They shouted for the missing men, but the only answer was the echo of their own voices, drawn out, distorted, as though someone else repeated them from the deep. It was said the forest remembered sound and replayed it when it was lonely. Each team that entered tried marking their route, but the jungle wouldn't allow permanence. Painted trees shed their bark, carved symbols sealed shut beneath layers of moss, and even ropes tied between trunks turned brittle and snapped in the night. The land refused direction. It wanted confusion. Some believed it was protecting a secret. Others said it simply enjoyed the chase. Either way, none could map it, and all who tried began to lose their sense of time. One survivor, if he could be called that, was found wandering the edge weeks later, covered in mud that smelled of decay. His eyes were glassy, his voice faint, repeating a single phrase over and over. It wouldn't let go. When questioned, he said he'd heard the others calling him from beneath the ground, begging him to stay. He claimed the jungle breathed with their voices, that when he walked, the earth beneath him trembled like it was trying to follow. He never recovered. Scientists came next, armed with equipment and logic, but the jungle mocked them too. Their sensors malfunctioned. Their readings contradicted themselves. One night, the recorders picked up rhythmic vibrations, steady, slow, like a heartbeat the size of the earth. They laughed at the thought until the sound grew stronger, shaking their tents, toppling their instruments. The team fled before dawn, leaving their data behind. The tapes later revealed whispers layered beneath the rhythm, speaking names no one on the team recognized. Locals warned against cutting the trees, saying each one contained something that didn't belong to this world. A logging crew ignored them once, and for a few hours the forest echoed with the sound of chainsaws. Then came the screaming. When searchers arrived days later, they found the machinery abandoned, blades wrapped in vines, engines fused with wood. No blood, no bones, just the impression of hands pressed into the bark, as if the men had tried to claw their way out of it. At night, lights flickered through the canopy, pale and green like will-o-wisps gliding between the trees. People said they were spirits, or perhaps the jungle's way of marking new victims. When villagers ventured close enough, they heard faint radio chatter in the glow. Military codes, static bursts, and orders from voices that hadn't spoken in decades. One man claimed to hear his father's call sign, though the elder had died long before he was born. The deeper parts of the jungle became a forbidden zone, marked on maps only as unstable terrain. No one questioned the label, it was easier than admitting fear. But the ground there wasn't unstable, it was alive. It shifted and pulsed like a sleeping creature, swallowing those foolish enough to tread too heavily. and sometimes at dawn, the forest exhaled mist thick with the smell of wet iron, as though it remembered the taste of the soldiers it devoured. Stories spread about strange figures wandering the outskirts. Men in rotting uniforms, faces obscured by moss and roots. They never spoke, only stood motionless until someone approached. Then they would turn and walk back into the jungle, leaving faint trails that ended in nothing. Those who followed too far never returned, and those who didn't swore they could still see the figures standing just beyond the tree line at night. The jungle began reclaiming everything around it. Villages, rivers, even the old roads that once led to its heart. Concrete cracked under crawling vines, and buildings vanished under walls of green. People said the forest was expanding, pulling the land back into itself, undoing what man had built. No matter how much they cleared, it always returned thicker, wilder, hungrier. Eventually, the military declared the region off limits. Satellite images showed strange patterns forming in the canopy, circles, lines, and spirals, far too precise to be natural. Some thought it was the remains of old trails. Others believed it was something else entirely. When analyzed closely, the patterns resembled fingerprints, massive ones, as if the jungle itself bore an identity and had begun to leave its mark. Yet, despite every warning, people still went in. Explorers, treasure seekers, thrill hunters. Some came back speaking nonsense. Others never came back at all. Those who returned said the jungle didn't just trap bodies. It took memories too. They couldn't recall where they'd been or what they'd seen. They remembered fear and the sound of bray. When dawn finally broke, the jungle looked calm. Too calm. Birds sang, leaves swayed, and sunlight spilled across the same soil that had swallowed entire squads. Their camps were gone, their tracks erased, as if they had never existed. The radio logs ended mid-sentence, rifles were rusted into roots, and the forest floor pulsed faintly with life. Whatever had awakened that night didn't vanish, it adapted. Some say it still waits, silent and patient beneath the canopy, listening for the next bootstep, the next voice that dares disturb its domain. Because out here, the jungle doesn't forget, it remembers every scream.